Our first speaker is Dr. Asha de Vos. She's a Sri Lankan marine biologist and educator. She has a BSc from the University of St Andrews, a master's from Oxford University in the UK, and a PhD from the University of Western Australia. Her research program, the Sri Lankan Blue Whale Project, forms the first long-term study of blue whales within the northern Indian Ocean. She's currently a postdoctoral scholar at the University of California in Santa Cruz, where she's working specifically on reducing the problem of ship strike of blue whales in Sri Lankan waters. And she's going to be talking to us today about exploring the unexplored. Please join me in welcoming Asha.
All right, good morning, everybody. Oh, goodness. I guess the party was really good last night. Thanks, guys. So I do want to make a small correction to the bio. I'm not a postdoctoral researcher anymore. That's done. I actually now run my own nonprofit back in Sri Lanka. But we'll get to that shortly. To start off, I want to say thank you. I think I'm a little short, but thank you for inviting me here. It's a really big honor to stand here and speak to all of you, particularly given the incredible lineup of plenaries. I love the fact that they threw me into the mix. I am very different to the next speaker. I am certainly a lot shorter than he is, so they did think about diversity in many ways. My relationship with this society actually started about in 2009 when the International Relations Committee gave me a grant to attend the biennial in Quebec City. It's also the last time I was this cold in October. But, you know, obviously I'm a glutton for punishment, so I keep coming back to Canada in October. But, you know, this year it was really nice because I got the opportunity to sit on that same committee to select which students could, you know, get grants to come to this meeting from the developing part of the world. And so that's kind of a nice full circle that I've come. And today I'm standing here on stage. And in the intervening years, I did apply to do, you know, get an oral talk in, but never did manage to just get posters. So I think it's fairly ironic that nobody ever allowed me to stand on the stage before, and today this is my first appearance, and I am a keynote. So there you go. So I'm going to tell you about my marine mammal odyssey, so to speak, with this incredible population of blue whales that I work with in the northern Indian Ocean. My story starts with this particular population. It goes back to 2003, when I was working aboard the research vessel Odyssey. And I think there's a number of people in this room who had the opportunity to actually be on this vessel at some point in their careers. And you know, we were actually tracking sperm whales, but my first encounter with blue whales happened off the southeast coast of Sri Lanka. It was this incredibly beautiful day. We were tracking these sperm whales acoustically, and I was up on deck looking out for like signs of life, and just couldn't find this low, bushy blow slanted off to the left-hand side. But as I searched into the distance, I did see this incredible sight over here. And as soon as I saw this, I knew it was produced by an animal that was gigantic and had these incredibly powerful lungs. And I was super excited, so I called down to the captain and I told him what I was seeing and asked if we could shift off the transect and kind of go in that direction, which, you know, he gladly agreed to do, which is great. And so we started approaching this whale, and as we got closer and closer, I started to realize that it wasn't just one blue whale, but there was actually an aggregation of blue whales in a pretty small area. And obviously at that point, I started to wonder, you know, it's the largest animal that's ever roamed on the planet, with 70% of the planet to roam. And why was it actually just hanging out in this small area in warm tropical oceans? So I was fresh out of undergrad, and I started to think about what I'd been taught and what my textbooks had said. And what I'd learned was that large whales like blue whales will undergo these long-range migrations between cold feeding areas and warm breeding and calving areas. So immediately I got super excited. Sri Lanka is 5 degrees above the equator, so it's really beautifully warm and tropical. But I got really excited because I actually genuinely thought I was going to be the first person in the world to ever document blue whales having sex. So we get closer and closer, and then soon I realized that that's not actually happening. There's no whale penises around. There's certainly no whale babies around. And, at that point I was thinking, what on earth is going on? And that's when we saw this. And so for me, this is a pile of blue whale poop. I'm sure many of you know this now. I'm extremely enthusiastic about it because it's beautiful. But apart from that, it is beautiful. But apart from that, I think the fact is that seeing that whale poop told me that these animals were feeding somewhere close. And, I thought back again and I was like, no, but these are warm waters, and how are they doing that? And how are they supporting themselves in these typically unproductive oceans? And so that was actually my eureka moment. My career started with a pile of shit. And that's cool. It's a great story. But, it's really, it is important because it's what kickstarted the Sri Lankan Blue Whale Project. That's where, I started to think, okay, I want to know more. This population is doing something different, and I want to unravel those secrets. So in the intervening years, I've actually had the privilege to, I realized that, okay, so if I want to really understand what this animal is doing in these waters, why it's behaving the way it is, I need to understand a little bit about its environment, how that environment influences the animal. So I moved into an oceanography lab for my PhD, which was a huge learning curve. They speak in equations and numbers. I definitely don't. But, I was able to show that actually the south coast of Sri Lanka is incredibly productive for that latitude because of the unique monsoonal circulation and how that interacts with our bathymetry. And it gives rise to these upwellings throughout the year. Also, through this work, I was able to show that the environment really does have a huge influence on the distribution of where we see these whales. That seems like common sense to you, but unfortunately, there is also misinformation that goes around, and there was a lot of misinformation about the fact that these blue whales were moving further offshore and because of the whale watching boats. And through this oceanographical work, I was able to show that no, in fact, it was to do with this crazy monsoonal system that had gone through in that particular year. We also know that this population of blue whales has a different acoustic dialect, and this is something that was actually unraveled by the Tulip expedition in 1983, headed by Hal Whitehead and Jonathan Gordon. And they defined this call, and it's called the Sri Lanka type call. These whales are also the smallest of all blue whales in the oceans. They're about 1/2 meter shorter than their counterparts in the southern Indian Ocean. They're a type of pygmy blue whale. They breed 6 months out of phase with those particular whales. And we know this information because there was illegal Soviet whaling in our waters in the 60s. And we also know that they have different behaviors. They lift their tail flukes up before a deep dive more often than anywhere else in the world. So in Sri Lanka, we see it about 60% of the time. I know in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, for example, it's probably about 20% of the time. So this is like a photographer's dream. Not only do you get to sit around in shorts and look at blue whales, but you can also take pictures of their tail flukes. So it's quite special. So as I started to put these pieces of the jigsaw together, I started to realize that there was something particularly interesting about this population. They were unique. They didn't seem to migrate out of the region. We have documented them. Obviously, we know they're feeding. We document courtship. So we see ménage à trois behaviors. We see really small calves. And so I realized that, there was something that needed to be done, particularly in light of some of the conservation concerns. And while none of the countries in our ocean basin have ever actually hunted whales or whaled out of these waters, like I said, there was illegal Soviet whaling in the 60s, and they took out almost 1,300 whales from a very limited range. So these animals are largely in the northern Indian Ocean. So taking out that number has impacts, obviously, on a population. But today we know that whaling isn't the biggest issue in our oceans for whales, and certainly not for this population. But instead, we face the big problem of ship strike. So if we look at a map of global ship traffic, you'll see that there's lots of lines, but all I need you to focus on is the yellow lines, because that's where you get the busiest shipping lanes in the world. So if we zoom in to the northern Indian Ocean around Sri Lanka where I work, you'll see that it's the south coast of Sri Lanka is home to one of the busiest shipping lanes in the entire planet. It's the main artery through the Indian Ocean. Everything from Singapore to Dubai two of the biggest ports in the world, travels through these waters. While global ship traffic has doubled since the 70s around these waters, it's actually quadrupled, showing how trade is changing, but also indicating that this problem is not actually going to reduce at any time soon. And if we zoom in a little bit closer and look at some of the data that's been collected over the years, the red lines are AIS data, so real ship movement data, and the black dots are where we've seen blue whales over the years. And what's immediately obvious is that the south coast of Sri Lanka, there is a distinct overlap between where we're seeing whales and where we're seeing ships. So obviously sites like this are not surprising. This is a blue whale that came into the main port in Sri Lanka, in Colombo, wrapped on the bow of a container ship. We know that it was killed on impact because it was a fresh carcass with signs of internal hemorrhaging. 12 days later, we found another carcass floating at sea with a massive propeller gash. Now, evidence like this is actually not always available because quite often carcasses will sink, they'll get pushed offshore, or they'll if they strand, particularly in our country where it's very hot and tropical, the carcasses will deteriorate really fast and it's hard to tell cause of death. But we know these are not isolated incidences because research of the Californian coastline, where this is also a problem, has shown that for every one that gets documented, there's at least 10 that have gone undocumented. So it is an issue, and certainly the biggest issue we face in our waters. So obviously this has just become my biggest crusade, trying to figure out how we can mitigate this problem. With the knowledge that ship strike is all of our fault. We're all to blame because 90% of everything is shipped. And so how do we mitigate the problem with a win for the whales but minimum impact on the shipping industry? Subsequent to, when I started talking about this, I actually spoke about it on big media, and that was I did have some issues locally as a result of bringing this problem out, but it brought other people in to also do work in this area. And when we collect all our work, we see that, in fact, 90% of the vessels that are using this shipping route are actually bypassing Sri Lanka. They're not stopping into our ports. So if we can shift the shipping lanes about 15 nautical miles offshore, we can have big wins because we are separating where the whales and the ships are, or where the whales need to be, rather. It's allowing, obviously that's wins for the whales, but also the impact on the shipping industry in terms of fuel consumption is quite minimal. And then on top of that, there are other wins. For example, there's a whale watching industry that uses these near-shore waters, and there's our fishing fleet in Sri Lanka is defined as subsistence because it's very near shore. So there's safety, obviously safety aspects to these stakeholders. And then it helps Sri Lanka to actually uphold some of the international agreements that we're signatory to. And in this case, particularly reducing coastal pollution, coastal ship-based pollution, in an attempt to increase the health of the communities that live in the coastal areas. So obviously this is like a quadruple whammy and sort of like a no-brainer to most of us. And then there's the 10% of vessels that do come into shore. They come near shore because they have to go into the local ports. Well, if, and this is an area we need to do more research on, but if we can ask them to slow down their speeds over specific areas that we know are important to the whales, then we can have a positive impact, because research has shown that if vessels travel at less than about 14 knots, impact is not lethal. And if we look at this map, this is actually the travel route of that vessel that hit and killed that blue whale that I showed you earlier. One thing that we managed to extract the data and look at the speeds that it was traveling at throughout its journey from southern India, Chennai, to Colombo, in our port in Colombo. And you can see that it far exceeded the 14 knots. It traveled at over 16 knots through the entire duration of its journey. So obviously, any animal that came in its path was doomed to die. So I guess, I'm talking about this work and, you're probably thinking, well, okay, so what now? Well, I can tell you that I've been working with the politicians. I advise the ministers and the departments to try to enact these changes and try to look at, the fact that we do need to consider the protection of these species, particularly looking at some of these recommendations. But, and yeah, ship strike has been addressed in other parts of the world. There's a lot of great work that's happened. But when I tell you my science story, the one thing that's totally missing from it is actually the human journey, sort of my challenges and what I face trying to get this work done, and why perhaps these lanes have not been shifted or speed restrictions already put in place. So while my story is obviously very tightly intertwined with these incredible creatures, I think that my work is not just about saving whales. I see my work as also an opportunity to show the world what capacity lies in the developing world, and the fact that we have talent, but perhaps we sometimes lack the opportunity. If you think about it, 70% of our planet is oceans, yet a disproportionate number of us actually work to protect it. 70% of our coastlines actually lie within the developing world, but where is the diversity at the global scale? Look around the room and you'll know exactly what I mean, right? How are we representing those 70% of coastlines? How are we allowing those diverse voices to come into our communities and to our societies? So I can tell you that, I believe very strongly in local solutions to address problems. I believe very strongly that if we want to change the current marine conservation trajectory, and if we want to save all these species that we're passionate about, we need local custodians on every single coastline who can empower, enable, and engage their people to create change. Let me give you the Sri Lankan context. Sri Lanka has been identified as a priority area for marine conservation because of its high species diversity, but also because it's in an area of high impact. Less than 1% of our oceans are actually protected. We are listed as one of the 40 worst funded countries for conservation. And in a recent study by the World Economic Forum that looked at gender gap, in 109 countries, there were 5 countries where gender gap has actually increased, and Sri Lanka is one of them. Now think about my story in light of what I've just told you, and think about what hardships that might actually bring to researchers like myself. The end of a 30-year war means that we're now experiencing unprecedented development and unsustainable development in the country because we want economic growth. We've shifted from a low-income country to a middle-income country. We want to stabilize our economy. And so, we're not really thinking about our natural capital, which is a really unfortunate thing. But we also lack the ability to sometimes address the challenges we face because there's a distinct lack of awareness about the oceans, but also a lack of capacity in marine conservation. And this is weird because Sri Lanka is this amazingly beautiful tropical island that has jurisdiction over 8 times more ocean area than land area. But when I started my career, when I started telling people, I want to be a marine biologist, everyone looked at me and was like, what are you going to do? How are you going to use that? And that means you're just never going to come home. And that was never an option for me. But the thing is that my work has now, luckily through my work, because I am very determined to change the way people in our parts of the world engage with the ocean and give them the ability to learn as I learn. And as a result, my work has started a marine conservation movement in Sri Lanka. So it's really exciting because more people than ever before want to go into this field. So now I know I have the people with talent who have a desire and are excited, and now it's about making opportunity. And so I established Ocean Swell, which is my nonprofit organization, because I believe in nurturing this next generation of diverse future ocean heroes. I believe in enabling students from underrepresented nations to engage in marine conservation. And also, I believe strongly in engaging everyone in conversations about the magic of our world's oceans. So I want to tell you a few things that I've learned along the way, and I think that are really important to this community as well. And I hope that they can help us to think about how we can broaden and open our doors to more voices in the future. First of all, diversity is strength, right? Big business has figured this out a long time ago, and so that's why they have such an agenda to increase diversity in their organizations. Diversity allows for a better definition of the problem, wider range of solutions, more accurate prediction of outcomes, greater productivity, and of course, sustainability. Knowledge is the foundation of innovation. So if we're not allowing people, if we're publishing behind paywalls and we're not allowing people to have the building blocks so they can blossom and grow their research and be innovative, then we're actually stifling a large part of the population and a large part of the world. And so we need to look beyond these journals with paywalls. We need to think about being open access. And fine, if you want to publish behind a paywall, feel obligated to actually get your work out in a different way. A lot of people from places like Sri Lanka don't actually have access to the vast majority of journals that a lot of you will take for granted. And so we need to make it accessible in any way possible. Tell stories, share blog posts, whatever it takes, get the information out there. But apart from the scientific community, we need to start engaging with everybody else. Because I know for a fact, as a marine conservationist, I'm not going to save these blue whales on my own. They may never get saved during my lifetime, but I know if I've shared the knowledge, I've enabled people and I've excited them about the prospect of protecting this population, the work can go on, and even after I die, this work will not end. And so we need to learn to grow our armies beyond this community. We need everybody to get involved, and the stronger voice we have, the more collective our voice, the more change we actually can create for all these creatures. Let's also reassess how we measure impact. Impact shouldn't be about how many papers you publish and what journal you published in, but it should be in the number of people that you have inspired and trained, and how your science is then also translated on the ground. And I think this is extremely, extremely important. I know for a fact that today I stand here, and there are a number of people in my career who have helped me and mentored me and encouraged me to go back and continue to live my dream. And I know those people look at me with a great sense of pride. I am their legacy, and your legacy can be a student. And a legacy in this form doesn't end with one paper, but it passes on for generations as I continue to work to pass on their goodwill as well. Let's do away with parachute science. So parachute science is when people from outside Western countries come into developing countries and do research and leave and then publish and just continue on their paths. And I say this because one thing is I've experienced it. I've had a lot of people come to me and say, can you get me a research permit so I can work in your country? I've also met researchers in our country because you have to have a local collaborator to do work in our countries. I've met researchers that are on papers, but when you talk to them, they have absolutely no idea about the work. And this means they're just faces and they're just names on a paper just for people to get permits. But there is no sustainability in this model because the minute these teams leave, nothing is left behind. So what I'm saying to you is, yeah, come, work in our countries, but think about how you're doing it. Consider the fact that you can bring in so much knowledge, training, infrastructure, and perhaps even funding. Come and train people. There's incredible talent where I come from. There's incredible talent in my region. Come and help people to stand up on their own 2 feet, because then you can have the confidence as you leave that country, that the work will continue, not for the duration of the project, but into the future, and that protection of that species will continue. That's incredibly important. And of course, that means that we have to sit down and reflect and think, what is it I'm trying to do? Am I trying to save the species and the oceans, or is it about my ego? Because if it's about my ego, yeah, I want to be the person on the ground. I want to be the first author on the paper. But if it's truly about saving a species, if it's truly about saving the oceans, then it's about sending more people out into the world to care and to make the change. And then I want to wrap up really by going back to that example or the story about me, actually, the irony of me standing here as a keynote today and never having got an oral presentation at the biennial conference. I was obviously tongue-in-cheek about it at the start, but I think there's a really important message there as well. And that is, we need to start thinking about how we actually judge people. And I don't have the answer for this, but I want all of you to start thinking about this. How do we judge people from a 200-word abstract? What are we looking for when we read an abstract? We're looking for the person's name, obviously, familiarity, what team they work with. Is it an incredible team that's done great work before? We want to see what innovative techniques they're using, what questions they're answering, what boundaries they're pushing. But what about those people we don't know, who are new voices, who we have no background information on? Maybe they won't have access to technology. And I can tell you, a lot of people that come from outside this circle, or outside North America, Australia, Europe, are usually working out of pure passion. Most people are working out of their own funds. They have absolutely no funding or infrastructure or support on the ground. They might be under political duress. And they might have other challenges that you have never thought about. Imagine my story. With my work, I've come under a lot of threat in Sri Lanka. I am a female in a male-dominated society. There was never a marine conservation movement when I walked in. We have a culture of extraction from the oceans, but never a culture of protection, and I wanted to change that on its head. All of these things worked against me, and if you read my abstract about some of the science I do, it may seem basic. It may seem like I've not pushed too far. But my backstory is so important to giving you context about what I'm doing. So try to think about that a little bit as we start to think about how we diversify. Unfortunately, when these researchers also are self-funded and they want to attend these conferences on their own steam, they'll come paying their own way because they don't come from big institutions. I mean, for me to come here, and I've been invited so few, but it costs about $3,000 for me to just fly here. There's all the other costs involved. So if someone tells me, well, your work is not good enough to do an oral presentation, but you can do a poster, the incentive for me to actually be here is much lower because I don't feel that the impact of my work will be so great. And so we start to lose these voices, and we start to make this community one where we hear the same voices over and over again. So I'm urging you today to think a little bit about the work that's happening, not in your backyard, but beyond. How can you assist? How can you be of help? How can you create your legacy, perhaps? If that's what you want to do, that's fine. But think about it. Think about how we can diversify and become more inclusive in our conversations, not just within this room, not just within this society, but also as we go beyond. And if we really want to save these incredible creatures that we have the absolute privilege to work with, never forget the privilege that we have to sit or stand side by side with the greatest giants that have ever roamed our planet. If we want to protect them, if we want to make change, it's time we started looking beyond. With that, I want to say thank you, and please follow the work at oceanswell.org. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Asha. That was wonderful. We have a few minutes for questions. We can take one or two. We're also going to ask our plenary speakers to stay after the plenaries, so please come up to them afterwards if you have further questions. Are there any questions for Asha? There's microphones up the front if you've got any. Do you want to repeat it?
How I started? Actually, my story is long, and I don't think everyone wants to sit and listen to it. But my start began when I was about 6, and my parents would bring back secondhand National Geographic magazines, and I believed that I could be those people, and I believed I would replace everyone's face with my own, because at that age, ego is such a big thing. You don't really care. And so I had parents who, I was lucky. I come from South Asia, where you're either a doctor, lawyer, or an engineer. But I had parents who told me to do what I loved and that I would do it well. And that's the one piece of advice I give everyone. That's the one piece of advice I hold closest to my heart. And that's what's enabled me to be who I am and do what I do and just really, as far as I can tell from where I come from, push the boundaries. So.
Thank you. Any more? Can't see. Well, if you want to catch up with Asha afterwards, please approach her then. We have something before you go. Damien organized an art exhibit at this meeting. It's down on the second floor, and there's a lot of wonderful artists to do with the marine environment down there. One of them, James Brown, actually gave us a few things that reach down deep. This is one of his art exhibits. It's a fish. You can display it anyway. And so that's from him as a thank you for coming.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.